Masechet Gittin Daf Mem Gimel. We're in the middle of a series of questions and challenges about the status of a slave that is in some way half free, half slave. Eved Kena'ani. And so now we're up to the next question. Ibaya lehu Eved shemecharo rabo liknas machor o eno machor. You have a master who sold his slave, but not the entirety of the slave. He only sold to someone else the right to collect a fine should his slave become damaged or killed. This is similar to sometimes a company will take out a life insurance policy on one of its workers because that worker is like a valuable asset. And should something happen to the worker, actor or whatever, then the company can collect money from it. So that's a source of revenue, potentially. So what if that company then wanted to sell the rights to that insurance policy to someone else, right? And they would be able to do that. So it's something similar here. And the Eved can be compared to a factory that makes 5 different items. And so you can sell the right to one of the items to someone else. Eved produces income by his work, but also by the fact that he can be injured or killed, and then someone would have to pay a fine. The fine goes to the owner. Okay, so that's what we're asking about. If a master tries to sell the rights to collect kanas for his slave, does that work? Is that a valid sale or is it not a valid sale? So let's detail the two sides of this question. Tiba'e l'Rabbi Meir, tiba'e l'Rabbanan, tiba'e l'Rabbi Meir. Ad kan la ka'amar Rabbi Meir adam makneh davar shelo ba'ala olam, ela kegon perot dekel de'abi de'atu. Aval hacha mi amar demin gach. So we're going to ask a question within the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says in other places, in other contexts, that a person can, in fact, buy or sell something that has not yet come into the world, like the produce of a certain palm tree, right? The dates that will grow on this palm tree next year, I am selling to you from now. Bibi Meir says that's a valid sale, even though there are no dates now, but you know that dates are going to come, and so you can sell futures. So fine, even Bibi Meir, who says you can do that, but in this case, who said that the slave is going to be gored? What are the chances, right? In the case of the date palm, for sure it's going to produce dates, unless it gets cut down or there's a blight. But the 99% chance it's going to produce something. But it's not likely that a slave is going to be gored, and so therefore he might say, even according to the Rabbi Meir, you can't sell something in the future that is unlikely to happen. And even if the ox is gored, even if the slave is gored, who says that anyone's going to pay? Maybe the guy won't end up paying. We won't know who it is, or he refuses to pay, or he has no money. And maybe he won't pay because he will be able to admit. The law of fines in general, is that if someone admits before they are proven guilty, then they don't pay. Like if I steal something and I'm caught, I have to pay back double. But if I come admit it myself, then I only have to pay back the principal and not the penalty. So to here, the person that gored, if he comes forward and says, I did it, they don't have to pay a fine. And so the chances that he's going to be gored and that he's going to have to pay and the fine will be paid are very, very small. And so even Rabbi Meir may agree that you can sell futures for the fruit, but not for slaves' fines. And we're going to ask the question also within the opinion of Rabbanan. Ad kan la kamri Rabbanan en adam makneh davar shelo ba'olam ele kegon perot dekel tashta mihaletnehu aval haka'eshor v'haka'e aibet mai. And even Rabbanan, who say you cannot transfer ownership of something that does not exist in the world, they say that regarding, for example, fruit of a date palm, because they don't exist. But here, we have the ox exists, the slave exists, so the basic materials for a transaction happening do exist right now. And the question is, will any particular ox, any particular ox, come and gore this slave? Then someone would have to pay the fine, and so I can sell the right to that fine. But the items that would be involved in such an incident all exist now. And even the Rabbanan, who say you can't sell something in the future, that's because the fruit doesn't exist at all. But here, the items exist. All right, so we have both sides of this question according to either of the Tanaim, and so can we find an answer? Let's attempt. Amar bi Abba Tashema Vilid Bayit Matamud Lomad Im Kinyan Kesef Ochel Yilid Bayit Lo Kol Sheken. The proof is going to be from this pasuk in Vayikra that says, Kohen ki kene nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochel bo. If a Kohen should buy a slave, kinyan kaspo, he buys him on the market, so that slave can eat teruma. Vilid beto hem yochelu belachmo. And also, a slave that's born into his household also can eat the Kohen's food, he can eat teruma. So we're wondering now, why does the pasuk need to mention both a slave that he buys, who was not born into his household, and also one that was born into his household? So this Baraita says, Vedid bayit. What does this teach? If a slave who I bought can eat teruma, then all the more so someone who was born in my house. Someone born in my house is even more part of my household than someone I bought from outside. So for sure, a baby born as a slave in my household should be able to eat teruma. So the Gemara answers, Ilu ken hayiti omer ma kinyan kesef sheyesh bo shaveh kesef ochel, af yilid bayit sheyesh bo shaveh kesef ochel. No, if I only had Kinyan Kesef, I would think that only it has to be like Kinyan Kesef. Just like a slave that I bought has value, has monetary value, so too, only a slave that's born in my house that has monetary value. You can't own something that doesn't have monetary value. So I wouldn't know that newborn, for example, can't do much work, and so therefore does not have monetary value, and so maybe would not be able to have teruma. So how do I know that even if it's not worth anything, it still can eat teruma? That's why the pasuk has to say yilid bayit. Even if it's born and has no current monetary value, still it's part of the household. So now I know that if it's a slave born in my house, whether it has value or not, it can eat teruma. Kinyan kesef yesh bo shaveh kesef ochel en bo shaveh kesef eno ochel. But now, how do I know that a slave that I bought can eat teruma? Not only if it's worth money, but even if it's not worth money. Let's say I bought a slave, it was worth money, but now it got sick and can't do any work, and now the slave can't do any work, can they still eat teruma? So we see from the fact that the pasuk puts them back to back, that we are comparing them. Just like with a newborn slave, even though it's not worth anything, can still eat teruma. So to one that I bought, even if it's not worth any money, still that slave can eat teruma. That's all the Braita. Now here's the proof that we can derive from it. In the last part of the Braita, I was wondering about a slave that is not worth anything, right? One that I bought, so that is not, but now it's not worth anything. How could there possibly be a case of a slave that's not worth anything if you think that I can sell to someone else the rights to the slave's fines, that if someone damages the slave, then I collect the fine? That would apply to any slave, even a newborn, even if it's even the slave who broke his leg and is sick and can't work. Even if they can't work and produce anything, they're still valuable because I can sell to someone else the right to collect the fines should it be damaged. And so since this Baraita does have a category of a slave that's worth zero, this is a proof that one cannot sell to someone else the right to collect kanas, futures of kanas futures on a slave, right? So that is the proof. But then we say no, it's not a proof. In ika eved terefa, there is. If a slave is so sick, that's like a terefa, just like a terefa animal is one that has a hole in its lung or some other disease that will not live for 12 months. Same thing with a human person is called terefa if they have a disease that they will not last 12 months. If an ox goes and gores and kills such an aved, there is no fine because that person is terefa, and therefore they are. It's not quite deathbed. Goses is within 24 hours, so this is not quite the same. But still, it has a law that you're not allowed to kill a terefa either. But the penalty for killing a terefa will not be there. And so we could be talking about an eved that's a terefa who would not collect kenas if it was killed, and therefore there are no futures for it. And so that's the case that this Baraita was talking about, that this could be worth nothing. But a regular Eved who is not a Terefa, it could very well be that the master can sell his Knas futures. So there's no proof. Okay, v'hachazi lemekam kameh. Hold on. Even that Eved has some value, even if it's Terefa, because it can stand up for the master. Even if it can't do any work, it can be an honor guard. So that when the master comes in, he stands up. When the master goes out, he stands up. And that gives honor to the master. That's worth something. How much would you pay for it? Whatever, something. So the answer is no. We're talking about not only is the slave a terefa, but it's also disgusting, has boils, and there's no honor there, right? The master doesn't want this guy with all boils and disgusting and smelly standing up before him. That would not even be an honor, to stay in your room and do nothing better. And so that, yes, you can have a case of a slave that's really worth zero, can't get any benefit from that slave. All right, good. Now, next question. Now back to the regular case of a slave, someone that is half slave, half free, and now he does kiddushin with a free person. So what happens, right? Does the kiddushin work or not? The free half of him can do kiddushin, but the slave half of him can't do kiddushin. So we're going to explain different sides of the question by comparing this case to two free people, where one person says to another, half of me will marry you, or I will marry half of you. So let's see. Im timse lomar ben Yisrael she'amar lebat Yisrael hitkadeshi lechetzi mekudeshet techazye lekule ha lachazya lekule. So if you want to say, this is a discussion in Masechet Kiddushin Daf Zayin, if a Yisrael, we're talking about a regular free Jew, says to a Bat Yisrael, be mikudeshet to half of me. Okay, so now in that case, and that works, mikudeshet. That is the opinion there, that you can do such a thing. Now in that case, why does it work? Because she is fit to marry all of him. So that even if I tell a woman, hey, marry only half of me, what I mean by that is, not that you could right half and left half. You can't split people that way. It's an expression that means, I'm reserving the right to marry someone else. I'll give you half of me, but not all of me. Okay. So in that case, since she can marry all of me, and really what I mean by that is simply that I'm intending to marry somebody else, but I'll be fully married to this one and all married to that one. So that's why it works. But in this case, it wouldn't be comparable because the free woman can only possibly marry half of the half slave. And so it's not even potentially, there's no potential possibility, right? Because in the half free, half slave, we're meaning it more literally, right? You're only married to half of him because the other half is a slave. Whereas when the free person says it, he means it figuratively, that you're married to all of me, but I reserve the right to marry somebody else. Okay, so even if you say in the free case mikudeshet, you could still say in the half slave case it would not be mikudeshet. On the other hand, you can also argue the opposite way. Now, this is the case of free people. That's free people, and it's flipped. If you say that a full Jew does kiddushin to a woman, and he says, I want half of you to be mikudeshet to me, that does not work. Because a woman can't reserve half of herself to marry somebody else. A woman can't be married to two people, so even as an expression, it doesn't work. So therefore, if I go to as a man, go to a woman and say, half of you is mikudeshet to me, the kiddushin is zero. Even so, the comparison is not going to be won't be the same law for our case, because there tishiyer b'kinyano, I'm left out the other half of you. I didn't take all of you. I have to be fully married. I have to take all of you, not half of you. All of you that's available. Whereas in the case of the half free, half slave person, that person is marrying as much as he can marry. So he's not leaving off any part of himself, right? Half free, half slave person goes to a free woman and says, as much as I can, I'm going to marry. So then that would be fine. It's only a problem in the previous case because the man is not marrying all that's available of the woman. But if the guy is marrying off all that's available of himself, then it would be good. Okay, so now we see the various possible logical deductions and comparisons to the case of free people. So now let's see if we can prove one way or another from a Braita Tashema. Hemit mi shechasyo aved vechasyo ben horin noten hasi knas l'rabo vechatzi kofed liyorshav. We saw this Braita already. If someone kills an ox, kills as someone who is half slave and half free, then the owner of the ox has to give half of the 30 shekel fine to the master, because he's half owned by a master, and half goes to the slave's heirs. Now, how does he have heirs? If you say that a half-free, half-slave person, the kiddushin is not kiddushin, then how will he have heirs? If he goes and tries, he can do an act of kiddushin with a free person, but the kiddushin will not be kiddushin. And if he just sleeps with her and has a child, that child will not inherit. And if he goes ahead and does kiddushin with a slave, this half-free, slave man does kiddushin with a slave also, that doesn't work. There's no kiddushin with slaves, and those children also will not inherit. Tosafot ask, actually, there are many cases of prohibited marriages where the kids will inherit, but you can look at Tosafot there for the answer. So here we're wondering, there's not going to be, if there's no kiddushin, there will be no legal heirs. So how could this Braita talk about that you give 15 shekels to the legal heirs? Who? Amar Rav Ada. So that's a proof that kiddushav kiddushin. Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava kesha'asaot terefa umay yorshav nafsheh. Rav Ada says, again with terefa, you see how these, even though there are different questions, the answers are linked. We're talking about a case where the ox gores and doesn't kill the slave, but only makes the slave deadish, dead that not dead yet, but will die within 12 months. And therefore, the owner of the ox has to pay. Now, who's the owner of the ox going to pay? Himself. He's going to pay the slave himself while he's sitting in bed waiting to die. He will collect. Now, even though it says Yorshav, his heirs, it means himself, right? He doesn't have heirs, because kiddushin doesn't work. It's just an expression to mean himself now that he's nearly dead, but he's still alive enough that he can collect his own fine. Good. Amar Rava, Shete Teshuvot Badavar. Rava tells Rav Ada bar Rava, I don't like your explanation, and I have two reasons why. Chada de Roshav Ketani. First of all, it says his heirs. It would say himself if it meant himself. Ve'od kofer hu ve'amad shakish kofer en mishtalem ela lachar mita ela marava ra'ui litol ve'en lo. And second of all, he quotes Shakish as saying that kofer, when this is the owner of the ox, is paying his ransom, And ransom is only paid after actual death. Only when the slave is fully dead, that's when the owner of the ox has to pay the ransom for the death that he caused. The ransom or the ransom for himself, because he was responsible for his shor. And so, but that is not paid for terefa, that's only paid after the person is dead. And therefore, it cannot be ravada that the ox just made him a terefa and dead-ish, has to be, we really killed him. So rather, Rava explains the baraita is talking about a case where, it explains this baraita as meaning that it would be fitting for the heirs of the person, of the slave, to collect the other half. However, this half-free, half-slave person cannot possibly have heirs, because kiddushin doesn't work. And so, therefore, he does not collect the kiddushin, and he does not collect the fine, because he has no heirs and he is dead, so he won't be. Nothing will be collected. But the point of the baraita is not to say that he actually does have heirs. It just said that theoretically, if he had heirs, then half the fine would go to him. So in the end, there is no proof from this baraita. We thought there would be proof because it mentions yorshav. Doesn't that mean that kiddushin is kiddushin? No, it could be that he cannot do kiddushin and cannot have heirs, and the heirs here just means theoretically if there were heirs, they would collect. Good. Amar Rava. Now, a new halacha. כשם שהמקדש חצי אישה אינה מקודשת, כך חציה שפחה חציה בת חורין שנתקדשה, and קידושיה קידושין. Rava says that just like a free man does kiddushin with a half of a woman, that doesn't work, right? There's no possibility. A woman has to be fully acquired and kiddushin to one man. She can't be married to two men. And so that's an established halacha from Masechet Kiddushin, as we saw. And Rava is going to make a comparison to our case. So too, a man who is half free and half slave, who does Kiddushin, the Kiddushin is no good. Sorry, shivcha, right? Now we're comparing the woman to a woman. Just like if a man tries to marry half a woman, it doesn't work. So too, if a free man tries to marry half shivcha, half bat chorin, it will not work. Because it's the same thing, right? In both, a man is trying to marry half of a woman, either half of a woman who's totally free, or the free half of a woman who's half a slave. It's the same thing. It won't work. All right. So this case is going to come up a couple more times. Darash Rabba bar Rav Huna. Rav Huna is going to say the same thing. Rava is a fourth generation Amora from Mehoza. Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, is a third generation. So actually going back in time from Surah. כשם שהמקדש חצי אישה אינה מקודשת, כך חציה שפחה וחציה בת חורין שנתקדשה אינה מקודשת. Same exact thing. A man cannot marry half a woman. A man also cannot marry a woman who is half shivcha, half free. Amar le Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda, however, objects to his colleague and says, Mi dameh hatam shir bekinyano, hacha lo shir bekinyano. It's not the same. In the case of all free people, if I try to do kiddushin with half of a free woman, I'm leaving off the other half. So that's why it's a problem, because I'm only taking half of what's available, even though the whole woman is available. Whereas in the case of half slave, half free, I go and do kiddushin with her, with her free half, I am taking everything that's available. I'm not leaving anything over. The other half slave is not possible, is not available. And so it's not the same, and therefore the half free, half slave should be good, as long as you do kiddushin with all of the available parts of the woman, then it should be fine. That's what Rav Chisda says. Hadar okim Rabba bar Rav Huna amora ale v'darash v'hamachshela zot tachat yadecha en adam omed al divrei Torah elim ken nichshal behen. And so we see the greatness of Rabba bar Rav Huna. He's willing to admit publicly that he made a mistake. And so after Rav Chisda taught him that, he got an amora, a meturgeman, a public announcer. In other words, he gave a big public official speech. This is when the rabbi sits and the Amorah stands, and the rabbi speaks quietly, and the Amorah speaks in a loud voice to tell everyone anything said in that kind of setting, which is called a pirka. A special official lecture, is really official, should be recorded on the books. So he wants to make sure that everyone knows that the previous thing he taught was wrong. And he first started off with a beautiful Agadah, a pasuk from Yeshaya, that this should be a stumbling block under your hand. He learns from this that Divrei Torah are established only if someone first has stumbles. Machshela hazot, first if you stumble, then tachad yadecha, then you can have it in your hand. And this is true, right? Whenever you're studying something or doing anything that's very difficult, the first few times you try, you're going to fail, until you come and you figure it out. There's no way to get it right the first time. And if you're not willing to fail, it's true in studying Torah too, right? You try, you learn a sugya, you see the stumbling block, roadblock, dead end, and only because you have all those failures, then you can get to the truth. If you insist on getting to the truth right away and won't refuse to change your mind, then it's more likely that you are wrong and you're never going to get to the truth because you won't admit your own mistakes. So very important Agadah. So he's saying, I messed up the first time, I stumbled, but now I acquired the correct opinion. And here it is. Af al pi she'amru ha'mekadesh chasi isha ena mikudeshet aval chesed shivcha v'chesed bat chorin shenitkadesha kiddushay kiddushin. My ta'ama hatamshir b'kinyano hacha lo shiyir b'kinyano. Says even though for free people, if a man tries to do kiddushin with half of a woman, it won't work. But that's not the same as if a man takes a half a slave, half free person. There it does work. Kiddushin does work because in the case of free people, he's leaving off half of the woman that's available, whereas in the half slave he is not leaving off any portion any free portion. He's marrying all of the free half. That's everything he can do. Okay, good. Now, third time we're going to have the same halacha, and then we're back to the original version of Rav Sheshat and Rabba Rav Huna before he changed his mind. Keshem she'mekadesh chasi isha ena mekodeshet kach chetzia shivcha v'chetzia bat chorin she'nitkadesha en kiddusheha kiddushin. So Rav Sheshat insists on, yes, we can compare them, and just like I cannot marry half of a woman, so too I cannot marry half of a woman who is half slave and half free. Vim lehashecha adam lomar ezohi shivcha charufa. Now I know someone may whisper in your ear a challenge to my halacha, and the challenge will be from the law of shivcha charufa. We saw those pisukim before. That if you have a shivcha who is designated to someone else, so they're not quite married, but in some way designated. There's two opinions about what the case is. We're about to see in a second. So if you have a slave woman who is designated in such a way, and then someone else, a third man, comes and sleeps with her, he does not get the death penalty because there was no actual kiddushin. It's not allowed, but there's no death penalty because it's not fully adultery. That's what the pasuk says. Now, what is the case? Zoch shechesia shivcha v'chesia bat chorin hameoreset le'eved ivri. The case of shivcha charufa is the case of a woman who is half slave, half free, and she did kiddushin with the eved ivri. It would be true if he was a free man also, but eved ivri is a better case because it's permitted, and eved ivri is allowed to marry both a slave and a free person, so he can be married legally to this half woman. So if they are do kiddushin, then if someone goes and sleeps with her, it's prohibited, meaning it does create an actual bond. Alma bat itirusehi. So we can prove that the kiddushin does work. Now, someone might whisper all that to you and say, look, it works. Rav Sheshat thinks it doesn't work. That's what he just said. It's the same. The two cases are the same. And if a man tries to marry half of a woman, half slave, the kiddushin is not going to work. Now, if someone should whisper to you and say, look at this shivcha charufa, where it's the same case, and it does create a prohibition against the third party, so you see the kiddushin does work, Emor lo kalech etzel Rabbi Yishmael. Well, then I'll tell them, go compare my explanation to Rabbi Yishmael's. My explanation, the one I just said, is Rabbi Akiva's. Rabbi Akiva said, Shifcha Charufa is talking about half free, half slave. So if you tell me what you said, I will tell you, Go analyze Rabbi Yishmael's interpretation. His interpretation is Shehu Omer b'shifcha Kanaanit hameorasad la'aved ivri. He thinks that's talking about a full shifcha Kanaanit who does kiddushin with an eved ivri. And in that case, if a third party comes and sleeps with her, he doesn't get the death penalty, but it's prohibited. Now, I'm going to ask you, if Shifcha Kanaanit, Bat Itrusehi, and does anybody think that a full Shifcha Kanaanit can do Kiddushin? No one thinks that. Ela ma'idlach lememar, my meoreset miyuchedet. Hachaname meoreset miyuchedet. Rather, what does meoreset here mean? Right? When we say Shifcha Charufa, and it says meorasai, who does Kiddushin, it's not full Kiddushin, it just means designated for him. Even though it doesn't create full Kiddushin, that's why there's no death penalty, but it does create yichud, a monogamous designation. And that's what it means for Rabbi Yishmael. And it has to mean that for Rabbi Yishmael because nobody thinks that a full shifcha can do kiddushin. So I'm going to say that also for my interpretation, which is that of Rabbi Akiva, that it's when it's a half kiddushin, it's a half slave, half free woman who does kiddushin. It's not really kiddushin, it's meyuchedet. And so, therefore, do not bring this as a disproof to me, because that's not a case of actual kiddushin. So I stick by my halacha. A half free, half slave woman cannot do full kiddushin. Good. אמר רב חיסדא, חציה שפחה וחציה בת חורין שנתקדשה לראובן ונשתחררה, וחזרה ונתקדשה לשמעון, ומתו שניהם מתייבמת ללוי. A new halacha. Well, it's related to what we just said. Someone who's half slave and half free, who does kiddushin first to an oldest brother, Reuven, and then she becomes free in the meantime. She doesn't get a get or anything. She just becomes free. And then the second brother, Shimon, Reuven's brother, does kiddushin with her. And then Reuven and Shimon both die. She has to do yibum with Levi. Okay. Well, why would I think not? Because in this case, I would not apply the law of the wife of two dead people, or someone who's widowed twice. Okay, this goes back to Yevamot. If a woman is widowed twice, how could that be? She was married to Reuven, and he died, and then one of the brothers has to do Yibum or Chalitza. Instead, Shimon does Kiddushin with her. So Kiddushin is not quite Yibum. So she never actually fulfilled her Yibum Chalitza thing. But there is some type of Kiddushin. It doesn't actually fulfill a full Kiddushin, but it does create some connection between them. If Shimon should die, now she's widowed from both Reuven and Shimon. In that case, the halacha is that the third next brothers cannot do Yibum anymore. Okay, so I don't say that here. Why not? Ma nafshach. I kiddushe de Reuben kiddushin, kiddushe de Shimon lav kiddushin. I kiddushe de Shimon kiddushin, kiddushe de Reuben lav kiddushin. Because, let's go back to the beginning, when this half slave, half free woman did kiddushin with Reuven. So, either it works or it didn't work. If it works, right, if that was real Kiddushin, so now she has Kiddushin to Reuven, when she gets freed, now the free half will join together, her slave half will join together her free half, so now she'll be fully Mikudeshet. Basically, the Kiddushin just completes itself and spreads to her entire being, and now she is fully married to Reuven. A fully married woman, if another man, doesn't matter who it is, brother or not brother, does Kiddushin, the Kiddushin is not effective, and therefore she is only married to Reuven. When Reuven and Shimon die, she's only the widow of Reuven. And if, on the other hand, you conclude what our discussion before and say that the Kiddushin is not a Kiddushin from when she's a half breed, then the Kiddushin from Reuven was never a Kiddushin, it was nothing. When she is freed, she's totally a free, unmarried woman, Shimon does Kiddushin. She's only married to Shimon and not Reuven. So Reuven and Shimon die, she's only a widow from one husband. And so either way, she will have, the Levi will have to do Yibum, or she can do Yibum with Levi. Okay, that's an interesting scenario. Next, Itmar, Chetzia Shivcha v'Chetzia Bat Chorin shenitkadesha leReuven v'nishtachrera v'chazra v'nitkadesha leShimon. Similar case, but now Reuven and Shimon are not brothers. See, so if a woman is half slave, half free, and she does kiddushin with Reuven, and now she becomes free, and then she does kiddushin again, another kiddushin with another guy, Shimon. Rav Yosef bar Hama Amar Rav Nachman. Pak'u kiddushe rishon. Rabbi Zera Amar Rav Nachman says Gamru kiddushe rishon. So two different opinions. Rav Yosef says as soon as she is freed, the kiddushin from the first guy disappears, and she is no longer married at all to Reuven. She's only married to Shimon. Whereas according to the Rabbi Zera, no, when she's freed, then the kiddushin to the first guy, it completes itself. When she was half slave, only her free half was married to Reuven. As soon as she's free, now her entire being is married to Reuven, and therefore she's only married to Reuven and not to Shimon at all. That's right, the opposite of Yosef, who says whatever level of yichud or kiddushin there is from the first guy, it does not apply anymore. She's totally not married to Reuven and therefore only to Shimon. All right, Amar Rabbi Zera, kivate didi mistabera dichtiv lo yumetu ki lo chupasha hachupasha yumetu. So Rabbi Zera says, I have a proof from mine that she is fully married only to the first. What's my proof? We're following Rabbi Akiva's interpretation that Shivcha Charufa is talking about half free, half slave woman. And that pasuk says that a third party guy who sleeps with her while she's in that state, the half free, half slave woman who does some kind of kiddushin, yichud, designation with a man, if a third party comes and sleeps with her, he does not get the death penalty. He says, lo yimetu. Why? Because she was not free. What does that imply? That if she would be freed, then that third party guy would die. That proves it to be Zera's point, that as soon as she's freed, that completes her kiddushin with the first guy, right? And that's why, if it were that she is freed, then she would be fully married to Reuven and therefore die. Therefore, the third party would get the death penalty. That's Rabbi Zera's proof. Amar laBaye ultana de Rabbi Ishmael de Amar b'shivcha kananit amers lebed ibri hachinamei dechit chupasha yumetu. Abaye said, okay, fine, that's a good proof only according to Rabbi Ishmael. But what about the school of Rabbi Ishmael? That's your proof is good for Rabbi Akiva. What about for Rabbi Ishmael, who says that Shivcha Charufa is a case of fully Shivcha Kananit, who does some kind of Erusin designation to an Eved Ivri. So there also, would you say, when she is freed, when this Shivcha Kananit is freed, she's married to the first guy? Nobody thinks that, because nobody thinks that if that yichud, whatever, doesn't turn into kiddushin, it just goes away. That's it. There's no more connection between them, right? So how would you interpret the pasuk according to the Bishmael? Ela may itlach lememar shechupsha vechazra v'nitkadesha. Hachaname shechupsha vechazra v'nitkadesha. Rather, has to mean that the third party doesn't die because she wasn't freed and then got remarried to someone else, right? The Bishmael would have to interpret it that way, because Bishmael says Shivcha Kananit, her designation to some Eved Ivri, once she's freed, goes to zero. So now she's totally unmarried woman. If a third party guy would come sleep with her, there would be no penalty. So the pasuk must mean that the third party doesn't get the death penalty because she wasn't freed and then remarried fully. So here too, I could say the same thing, and therefore, no, you do not, Rabbi Zera, you do not have a proof. Okay, last discussion from this Mishnah. Amar Rav Huna bar Kitina, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. מעשה באישה אחת שחסיה שפחה וחסיה בת חורין וחפו את רבה ועשאה בת חורין. Once there was a case of a woman who was half free and half a slave, and Rabbah forced the owner of half of her that was a slave to free her so she would be free. We started off this whole discussion from the Mishnah is that this is the law of Tikkun Olam for a man, because a man it's not right for him to be half free, half slave, because then he can't marry anyone. And so in this case it was the woman, and still Rabbah forced the owner to free her. Why did he force the owner to free her? Keman כרבי יוחנן בן ברוקה דאמר שניהם הוא אומר ויברך אותם אלוהים ויאמר וגומר פרו ורבו ומילאו וגומר. Must be that Rabba was following the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, who says that the mitzvah of Peru Revu applies to both the man and the woman. The other opinion over there says that applies only to men, have to have an obligation for Peru Revu, and that's why, according to that opinion, you would say I have to free a man, right? As we saw before, Lo tohu bera'ah, the world, God did not create the world to be empty. Rather, He wants people to procreate, and therefore the slave man, who's half free, half slave man, has to be freed so he can go and get married and have children. That would apply to men, and everybody agrees that Peru Revu applies to men. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, however, says it also applies to women, so it must be Rabbah who freed a woman. He follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, right? No, we say not necessarily. No, different reason. The reason why Rabbah forced the master to free this half slave is because people were taking advantage of her, because she was half a slave and not married, and there's no one to protect her. Not because she can't marry a free person, she can't marry a slave person, so that put her in a difficult situation, and people were sinning. And also she was suffering, so that's why the rabbis forced the master to free her, but not because she has to fulfill Peru Revu. Could be that we were following not Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, who say that the only man is commanded with Peru Revu. We now come to the next Mishnah. Hamocher avdo legoyim o lehutz la'aris yasa ben horin. Amazing halacha. If a Jew owns an Eved Kena'ani, an Eved Kena'ani is chayav in many mitzvot, the same as a woman are chayav, even though he's not fully Jewish yet. And so if a Jew then sells this Eved Kena'ani to a non-Jew, and now under the non-Jew, they're not going to be able to keep the mitzvot. The non-Jew may work him on Shabbat, and so this is a problem. And so this is in the series of Tikkun Olam, even though it doesn't say Tikkun Olam here. This is for the benefit of this person that we force the Jewish owner to free his slave, kind of a penalty against him for doing that. Now, of course, he still will be owned by the non-Jew, and the non-Jew is gonna treat him as a slave still, but it'll still have an effect that if he ends up getting free, running away, somehow getting free from the non-Jewish owner, he doesn't. That's it. He's severed his relationship and ownership from the Jew. This is also true if the Jewish owner sells him to anyone else outside the land of Israel, assuming they live in Israel. Also, he must set him free. Why? Because there's a mitzvah to live in Israel, and there is a prohibition, if you live in Israel, for a Jew to leave Israel, and that applies to the Eved Kenani also. He has the privilege of living in Israel and fulfilling all the mitzvot that are in the land, and now this master forced him, because it's not his choice to leave, he's forcing him to leave Israel, so he also gains his freedom thereby. Okay, very Zionistic halacha here. Tenor banan, hamocher avdo legoyim yasa lecharut v'sarich get shichrur merabo rishon. So Braita teaches that, similar to the Mishnah, if someone sells his Eved Kenani to a non-Jew, he gains his freedom, but the first master, the Jewish master, still has to write him a get shichrur to finalize and complete the full freedom, so that he can go and marry a Jew. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, במה דברים אומרים שלא כתב עליו ono, אבל כתב עליו ono, זהו שחרורו. Rashbag says you only have to write a get shichrur if the Jewish master did not write this ono document, but if he wrote this ono document, then that is equivalent to a get shichrur. What is it? My ono, Amar Rav Sheshat, de katav lehachi lecheshetibrach mimenu en li isek becha. He writes in the document that, listen, if and when you should escape from your new non-Jewish owner, I have no business with you. From my perspective, if you run away, get free, then you are totally free from my part. So that is the same. It's just the language does the equivalent of a get shichrur. Get shichrur says you're no longer my slave. That's what this is doing also, and therefore that is good enough. Tenor Rabbanan, lava alav min hagoy, kevan she'asa lo goy nimuso yasa lechairut. Okay, now a slightly new case. if a Jew borrows money from a non-Jew, and the Jew owns a slave, Eved Kanani, that he's using as a lien towards the debt. Now, what if he ends up not paying the debt, and now the slave, which the goy has a lien on, was going to be transferred? So at what point does he gain his freedom? So the Mishnah talked about when he makes a sale, the Jew sells his Eved to the non-Jew, he goes free. Here, it's not actually a sale, but rather is going to be collected in payment. So at what point exactly does the slave gain his freedom? And the answer is when the non-Jew treats the slave according to his nimos. It's from the Greek word nomos, which means law. Then he goes free. My nimuso, and what is that referring to? Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda nashke. It says they're referring to a seal. Non-Jews, when they bought a slave, they will put a seal, some kind of a stamp, or a tattoo, or a bracelet, to indicate this is my slave. And so whenever that happens, as soon as this slave is being treated according to non-Jewish practice, with the way non-Jews treat their slaves, then that's it. That is considered the transfer. It's not necessarily, there could be other points in time, when the deadline, when he has to pay, when they go to court, right, when there's an order that your mortgage goes there. So this Baraita is teaching us that it's at the moment of the stamp of the non-Jew upon his slave, then the slave goes free, same as if the Jew sold it to him. All right, so that's one interpretation of the word nimuso, means a seal, but now we have a challenge to that interpretation. Mativ Rav Sheshat, harisin v'hachirot v'hariseh batei avot ve'goy shemishken tzadeh l'Yisrael af al pi she'asa lo nimuso petura min ha'maaser. So this Baraita has 4 cases of land that's owned by a non-Jew, but a Jew has some relation to it, and it will make a difference in being maaser. This is land in Eretz Yisrael, and this is following the opinion that says that land in Eretz Yisrael that's owned by a non-Jew, you don't have to give maaser, even if a Jew is actually working the land. So that applies to a sharecropper or tenant farmer, that they get to keep part of it, but they have to pay part of what grows to the owner. So in this case, the owner is a non-Jew, so they don't have to give maaser. And this is true even for a family of sharecroppers, where the Jewish family lives and works that land for many generations. Still, they don't own it, so they don't have to give maaser. And here's the relevant case for us: a non-Jew that used land as a lien for a loan that he took from a Jew. Now, this is going the opposite direction. And then the question here is, at what point does the land transfer from the non-Jew to the Jew? And here it says, even though he did nimusa, even though the non-Jew did something with the land according to the practice of the Jew, even though he treated it as Jewish land, nevertheless, petura min ha'maaser, you don't have to give maaser. That's not considered transferring. So now we're going to have a challenge, because these contradict each other. And the first one, whenever there is this nimusa, the transfer does happen. And regarding the land, whenever the nimusa happens, the transfer does not yet happen. So we're going to ask about that in a second. But first, we just want to know what the definition is. And if you think nashke means a seal, do you put a stamp on a piece of land? You can tattoo a slave, but you don't tattoo a field, so it can't mean that. And assuming that means the same thing in both cases, Ela Marav Sheshat Zman. We're talking about a time, meaning a deadline, a date that's in the contract. And so if there's a date in the contract for the loan, in this case, these are both cases of loans. So when there's a date in the contract, then that's what causes that's the deadline for to pay up, and therefore that will trigger the transfer. And that applies in both, because both a loan with a slave as a mortgage or a loan with the land as a mortgage, both are loans that can have a date. And so that makes sense. That's a definition that can apply to both. All right, now we have a definition that applies to both, but now we have a question about the ruling. Kashya azman. We have a problem, because here it says when you have a date, a deadline written in this contract with the goy, then and asalo nimuso, then the transfer does happen, the transfer from the slave from the Jew to the non-Jew. Whereas in the case of, and therefore goes free. Where in the case of the land, even though there has nimusa, has that date, but pituraminamas, meaning it's still owned by the non-Jew, and the transfer doesn't happen. So why is that? We have a couple of answers. La kashya ha de metazimne ha de la metazimne. Oh, both of them have a date written, but in one case, the case of a slave, that's talking about a case where the time has arrived, and the deadline has arrived, you didn't pay it, and therefore the transfer happens. Whereas in the case of land, there is a date there, but the date did not yet arrive to pay, and that's why the transfer didn't happen. So that would be a simple answer. But then we reject that. But that would be obvious. You tell me, when a slave, in the case of the slave who used as collateral, when the time to pay up, the deadline has passed, so then of course that if the deadline passed and you didn't pay, then of course the slave is going to be transferred over and thereby go free, just as if it was sold. So why would you even have to say this? It would be a simple case. Rather, we're going to go back and say actually both of them is when the deadline did not happen. And there's no question, there's no challenge to the contradiction between the two cases. In the case of the slave used as collateral, it was the body of the slave that was the collateral. So now, therefore, at a certain point in time, the body will be transferred. Whereas for the field, it's not that the ownership of the field was mortgaged, but rather only the produce. If I don't pay you in time, then the produce that the field produces, you can collect that as payment. And so that's why it's patur from mina maaser, because the land itself, the ownership is retained by the non-Jew the whole time. So that's why it's patur mina maaser. And another answer, it could be that both cases are talking about where the loan was done on condition of having a mortgage of this collateral, but he did not yet collect the collateral. In other words, the lender says, I have a right to collect the collateral, but did not actually go and collect the collateral. And in that case, it applies differently for a land and a slave. Regarding the land, as long as he didn't collect the land, so this is the Jew collecting the land, he didn't collect the land for his loan, so the land is still owned by the non-Jew, and you don't have to give maaser until he actually goes and physically collects it. Whereas for the slave, the moment that the non-Jew has a right to collect the slave, the slave is considered as if transferred. It takes more to transfer land, which is a physical, non-movable item, than it does for a slave that is a movable item. And therefore, even just the right to collect the slave to the loan, even though he didn't actually collect him yet, is sufficient to call that a transfer, and the slave thereby gains his freedom. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.